Good morning. Volume okay? Yes. Thanks for letting me come down to the podium and talk to you for a few minutes about AALAC's perspective on this issue. I will confess, however, that I've been struggling a little bit throughout the morning. This is an audience of very highly educated people. Am I the only one that there's this sort of Pavlovian dread by the notes on the board here? Just brings back, I recall this recurring dream I have where I'm back in college and I have to make it my way to the final exam in calculus. It's always calculus. I've not been to class all semester. I can't remember where the class is. I'm not sure when the exam is. And this awful sensation that I've got to sort of measure up and pass this exam. And I always wake up in a cold sweat. So I don't know if I'm the only one who has that, but I've been struggling all morning.
Does that mean you didn't get the note about the team project?
That's exactly what that means, yes. I pushed the wrong button. Let me try another one. I'll just push buttons until something happens and we'll go with the flow. So I'm going to give you the AALAC perspective, and then I'll drift around a little bit. I do that intentionally. There's been a lot of discussion on this topic, particularly recently, since the implementation of the 2011 guide. That's both been true at the AALAC Council level, and I'll go into some of that, and our industry as a whole. So is this something new? And the answer for AALAC is no, not really. There's not been any great change in the way AALAC views this issue. The 96 guide did have language about social housing. Page 22 example here sort of puts in context a lot of what we've heard already this morning, and that conspecific social interaction should be allowed either between or within enclosures. And then this comment on page 26. Now this is, again, the 96 guide. Whenever appropriate, social animals should be housed in pairs and groups. 3 statements. I won't say my search of the 96 guide was exhaustive, but this is what I turned up. So it's not a new topic, but nor is it confined to these 3 previous statements in the guide. So if we look at the 2011 guide, we see a lot more references involved here. In fact, I found, as we all have, entire sections devoted to social housing of animals. Now, this is across all species. This is animals in the lab, so to speak, whatever the lab may be, whether it be a field study or in a biomedical setting. 33 different text references and 24 separate pages referenced. The guide has a lot more to say today than it did several years ago. Hence our discussion. So it stimulated us to think about this topic in a renewed way. Veterinarians have done this, and IACUCs have done this, and researchers have done this from a variety of different angles. But the guide, I think, now challenges us to sort of level the playing field and think about where we are with this topic. A lot more discussion. Dr. Wyatt's an AALAC council member, and he'll remember this. When the 2011 guide came out, these comments in the guide, I pulled these out in particular, prompted the AALAC Council to think long and hard about what is it that AALAC expects, what do these statements mean, and how are we going to assess programs as to whether or not they're achieving these goals. Single housing should be the exception. A should in the 2011 guide is a strong recommendation. So the council really debated this language. What does this mean? What do we expect? The answers weren't terribly clear. The next one includes what I call a should-must dichotomy. The guide has this in a variety of places, and boy, it creates heartburn at AALAC. So I don't know if you can pick this out in this bullet point number 2 here. Appropriate housing space or enclosure should account for the animal's social needs. Nice, easy thing to say in one sentence. They should be housed in stable pairs or groups, compatible individuals, unless they must be housed alone. So there's a should-must thing there. There's sort of this implication that we should do this because it's benefit of the animals, but if we're going to single house, there is a must kind of flavor to that. So what does that mean? So the long and the short of it is that AALAC developed this position statement, which is sort of a proclamation of the direction AALAC is going to take on this issue. It's sort of a rule of the day, so to speak. It's telling the scientific community that this is AALAC's view of this topic, and I'll get to that in a minute. It's not anything new. It's been out for a couple of years now. Also an FAQ to sort of go hand in glove with this position statement to provide some guidance about what we expect. Before I get to that, I'll briefly mention an analysis of all the findings discussed at AALAC site visit exit briefings since we began using the 2011 guide. 4,815 findings, 671 site visits. So it's a big, robust data set. This is the program components and where we tended to find the most and the least findings. And you can see that the blue slice of the pie there is animal environment, occupational health and safety, and then the green larger area is IACUC issues. If we look a little closer at this animal environment section, about 23% of all those findings in animal environment relate to issues of social housing. So in that blue section of the pie, the animal's environment, almost 25% of the time, we're talking to you about concerns we may have about social housing. So that's what the data show. Let's get to the position statement. AALAC sort of rephrased the terminology of the guide, and we said, we think that should be the default method. We understand that that's a paradigm shift. It's not necessarily the long-standing method. So based on the verbiage of the guide, and the council was very careful and intentional about this language. We expect it to be the default. If there is single housing, there should be justification for that based on three broad areas: incompatibility, behavioral incompatibility of the animals, veterinary concerns, or scientific necessity. When you do single house, I want you to think about some specific issues very carefully. Number one, that'd be limited to the minimum period necessary. If possible, maintaining visual, olfactory, and protected contact. We've heard a lot about that this morning, and the pluses and minuses associated with that. Again, for appropriate species. If there is single housing, we expect you to think about environmental enrichment in a very careful way and augment that when it's appropriate. An appropriate positive human contact and intermittent full contact in play or exercise areas. Considerations for those things when animals must be singly housed. When they are singly housed, it's not sort of a okay forever kind of arrangement, we think at AALAC, that the IACUC and the AV, and probably the investigator, need to rethink this paradigm for those singly housed animals on a regular basis. How often? Probably depends on the science and the animals and your context of your institution. But I think we can state this another way. People have had a lot of confusion about AALAC's point of view on this. And I think this captures it. It's the default mechanism, social housing, but if you have to singly house, it should be an intentional decision on the part of the PI and the IACUC to do so, based on those three broad areas of justification. The bottom line is when the site visit team comes in the door to do an evaluation of your program, we expect that we'll see some singly housed animals, and we'll ask about that. And if you've sort of had your ducks in a row, yep, the IACUC knows about it, it's justified either in the protocol or by some other method, and here's why, and there's a rational, logical, careful, thoughtful process for single housing, we say, okay. If we get the deer in the headlights look like, oh, we forgot about these animals, then we're going to say that's not okay. Social animals need to have the consideration for social housing. And that'll be a topic of discussion at the exit briefing. So the AALAC FAQ provides a little bit more detail on sort of what we think when we're talking about social housing and what we mean. Now, when we say social housing, we mean full-time para-group housing, continuous. There's some debate about whether or not that's right, but that's sort of the AALAC opinion. The FAQ goes one step a little further, and we think this issue of the importance of the social environment of animals is a spectrum. On one hand, you might have complete isolation. Hopefully we don't see this at all, or rarely, maybe when there's a scientific necessity perhaps. But frankly, we don't see this very often. So that's one end. The other end is full-time continuous housing. But there's more to it than that. In other words, we think it's not an all or none decision. The science may dictate that they can't be group housed, but there may be other things you can do. We've heard about this morning. I thought I had all these novel messages to deliver. Turns out I'm just reiterating what others have said. So it's a continuum. Single housing, maintaining other sorts of visual, auditory, olfactory contact with conspecifics. Now I'm beginning to wonder about our definition of conspecifics and what that means. Thank you very much. Protected contact, maybe a little bit further along this spectrum. The FAQ describes these as other considerations other than just the all or none, yes or no, full-time social housing. And then finally, part-time group housing, play or exercise areas, termed intermittent housing earlier. I like that term. So it's a spectrum. If you have trouble with full-time housing, it's not immediately full-time single housing. There may be other strategies. You got to think about that. We need to slice this issue in a little bit more granular terms. So the council's thinking about this when we do site visits as they come in the door. When there is single housing, we're looking for the institution to have paid a bit more attention to augmented environmental enrichment. So single housing is required by some means, so what do? I won't go into environmental enrichment, but this is another issue in which we sort of take an all or none approach. We put a few things in the cage and we say, gosh, that's good, and we walk away. We're not sure if it's relevant, salient to the animal, meaningful, maybe it causes stress, maybe it spreads disease. There are a whole host of issues with environmental enrichment that we expect you to consider carefully. So, species specific, relevant to those species, considering both their psychological and their physical needs, addressing sensory and motor needs. The Ag Guide has sort of 5 areas they define. I like this. There's social enrichment, occupational, which is more locomotor or task-oriented kinds of enrichment, physical, sensory, and nutritional. That's how the Ag Guide defines it for farm animal species. I like that terminology. Also increased positive human contact, and we're looking very carefully for this, increased behavioral surveillance. If the site visit team comes in and finds singly housed animals and they're healthy, they're well adjusted, no aberrant behaviors noted, that's one scenario. A lower level concern, we'll ask about it, whether it's justified. But if we find aberrant behaviors and issues associated with those singly housed animals, we're going to be more concerned because we have behavioral problems evidenced. And we're going to ask you about that. Have you seen these? Are they on your radar? Were they noted as abnormal? Does the IACUC know about that? Are you watching that? All sorts of downstream questions will follow depending on what we see in the cage. So that goes to staff training and experience, as well as the IACUC's role in being informed about the social experience of these animals. Which brings up the role of the IACUC. We think they're the hub of the wheel at most things, and certainly on this issue. We expect the IACUC to set the institutional expectation for social housing. That 23% of those animal environment findings I showed, many times the IACUC was just not addressing this issue. And I can tell you when that occurs, when the IACUC says, yeah, well, you know, we thought about it, but we just haven't really tackled this problem yet. The council will call that a mandatory deficiency. So that's a serious concern that the IACUC has sort of failed in its role to consider the social needs of the animals. When you do have single housing, there are many ways to sort of consider and improve that. It's a matter of scale. It can be protocol by protocol justification. Maybe the needs of the science dictate single housing. Maybe within species issues, maybe housing boars together has been completely unsuccessful at your institution, likely. So why keep trying to do that? Maybe there's an exception based on male mice or male boars or boars or males of any particular species. So there might be a program-wide consideration of this issue that you've thought about, and the IACUC has sort of made a policy. It's a matter of scale. If you only have a few exceptions, protocol by protocol probably makes more sense. If you're a breeding institution with 50,000 mouse cages, justifying every male mice being singly housed might get a little onerous. We're not suggesting that you have to do that. So it's a matter of scale. It's a good idea to document the IACUC's logic when they approve single housing, not just for AAALAC, we'll be interested in that, but also so you can be consistent in your decision making about this issue. We expect the IACUC to monitor single housing and the effects of social housing, the success of the social housing program, and monitor those behaviors and the interventions associated with aberrant behaviors. So I'll digress here a little bit from AAALAC. Considerations. I think that's pretty straightforward. AAALAC says if you're going to singly house animals, it has to be intentional, it has to be on purpose. You have to have a good reason to do it. That's pretty straightforward. That's kind of end of the AALAC message. It's not quite that simple, though, is it? We all know better. In consideration of the science, I mean, in most of our programs, that's why they're there. The duration on study might be an impact. If you have a few rabbits on study for 2 weeks, that's different than some antibody-producing rabbits that might be in the facility for 3 years. Two different scenarios. So the science, duration on study is really impactful. What is their normative behavior? You've heard excellent remarks about this already, both in nature as well as in the lab. What is their social repertoire and aptitude? How likely are they to succeed in these social group settings? And others more experienced than I have already commented on these issues. I think we're a bit naive sometimes when it comes to things like individual variation. I've been guilty of this. I'm a veterinarian. I've spent a lot of time trying to socially house rabbits. And I started that process thinking, they're rabbits. They're all the same. They all look the same. They're all New Zealand white bunnies. They're all behave the same, right? Wrong. Those of us that have tried that realize that we were really very naive and very ignorant in our expectations of what success was and how difficult it might be to achieve that for all sorts of reasons. So now we understand this is kind of more complex. We must not forget that we live in a practical world, and we have to consider sort of this cost-benefit analysis. Both this is true in looking at the animals. It's also an institutional perspective. We can't ignore this. How do we know that social housing is working for our program, for these animals, and for the science? We know that there's stressors and conflict associated with social housing. How do we measure that and the impact that has? It's not an all or none, easy yes or no, black and white kind of issue. It has an impact on the science, no question about it, as does single housing. But we've single housed over the years, and so scientists have come to expect that as sort of the norm. So if we shift to a social setting, then all of a sudden we're shifting maybe some scientific measures. We have to acknowledge that we're impacting that science. It's not necessarily good or bad, it's different. Although we tend to characterize any change as bad because we don't like it. But we know that social housing will induce a lot of change in some of these scientific measures, and we have to acknowledge that. PIs have a real concern about the things we do at the cage side, and for good reason. Kate did an excellent job this morning of raising this point of managing conflict. And we get this question a lot at AAALAC. Well, we got in some bunnies and we put them together and it was World War III, so we stopped. And we're done with that. And so is that good enough? And that's a tough question. I'm not sure we at AAALAC know the answer, but we're going to expect a good faith attempt to really make this work. And sometimes you say, well, it doesn't work, either for these animals or for these groups of animals. But to try once and sort of hang it up probably doesn't meet the requirements, at least in our view. What exactly is a good faith effort? We expect you to define that. We're going to ask you that question, but we get asked that question a lot. So what constitutes a failure, and you have to resort to single housing? Tricky issue. And then there's institutional resources. We see this all the time. Well, we house our rabbits singly because that's all the cages we have. And if we go buy different cages, that's $750,000 that we don't have. So this is not a trivial issue. Whether or not it's a justification, that's a tricky question. But the practical issues do come into play. We see this all the time. We've given institutions at AAALAC a period of time to buy caging, implement new strategies, because there are costs and changes associated with that. But managing the institutional resources of the program is a real issue. So some trend data, I'll go quickly through this. This is a little finer look at that blue section of animal environment. So if we look at all the findings in the animal environment category, husbandry issues are the most numerous, sanitation, and then this behavioral and social management third, microenvironment in cages, and macroenvironments the facility. So that's where it sort of falls on the spectrum. But if we look at it a slightly different way, if we look at mandatory findings only, those findings that you must address to maintain accreditation, almost 58% of all those mandatory findings in the animal environment relate to social housing. So clearly this is a paradigm shift for institutions. You're on the path, but half of our mandatory findings in this category relate to social housing. That shows that we have a lot of work to do. If we look at all findings, 4,815, behavioral and social management was ranked third among the most commonly cited mandatory issues. These are cases in which the IACUC has not fully considered the social needs of the animal. Not institutions that are trying and they have strategies and they're working towards that. Now, these are institutions where they just sort of forgot. Half of all mandatory findings relate to social housing in the animal environment. So we're finding this quite often. We think this will tail off as you get better at dealing with these strategies. The challenges we see probably won't surprise anybody. Rabbits, everybody's struggling with rabbits because we thought we could just put them together, end of discussion, and we find that's not the case. Also in some ag programs where there's a long-standing history of certain kinds of housing, say with sow confinement. Bernie mentioned this earlier in the day. There's been a long history of confinement for gestation or farrowing crates. If your measure is number of piglets weaned, that looks like a reasonable cage paradigm. But maybe we ought to be looking at other measures with regard to the overall social complexity of sows. So programs are having challenges dealing with that. Part of that is caging, part of that is our thinking. Programmatic uniformity. People think about non-human primates, they think about dogs, we're thinking about rabbits, but sometimes we forget about all the other species there. So IACUCs are not necessarily uniform in the attention they give to the variety of species at the institution. So we see some ups and downs there according to species. And then caging, I've already mentioned, it's expensive. We have to acknowledge that. So that's what we see from the AAALAC perspective, and I will be quiet. Social housing is conceptually very easy, but it's very difficult to implement effectively. I think we've heard that this morning and probably will throughout the next day. Thanks.